13. Abaddon the Despoiler has launched 13 Black Crusades out of the Eye of Terror. 13 times the largest chaos force ever assembled poured through the Cadian Gate. 13 times civilizations burned, billions died, and the Imperium bled in ways it came close to not surviving. And 13 times the campaign ended before it finished the job. The Warhammer 40,000 fan community has spent decades defending Abaddon against the mockery, Failbaddon, the memes about detachable arms, the persistent implication that he is, at bottom, a loser with a very good sword. The current defense, close to Games Workshop's official position now, is that Abaddon is a long-game strategist. Each crusade achieved specific dark objectives, each step paving the way for the next, the apparent failures masking a coherent plan called the Crimson Path. That defense may be partially correct, but it's answering the wrong question. The question that argument never asks: who benefits from a war that never ends? Because the Chaos Gods that Abaddon serves need a living Imperium to feed from, and a dead one is a very different thing from a wounded one. Establish the record first. The First Black Crusade erupted in 781 M31, 5 centuries after the Horus heresy ended. Abaddon led the combined traitor legions through the Cadian Gate in an assault large enough to force the Imperium to permanently transform Cadia into a fortress world, and personally descended to the demon world of Urulon to fight his way through a haunted labyrinth and retrieve Drachnian, a bound warp entity that had fought the Emperor of Mankind himself in the Webway during the heresy. Not a campaign footnote, a specific acquisition that made Abaddon into arguably the most dangerous individual combatant in the post-heresy galaxy. The Second Crusade, 597, M32, targeted the Bellis Corona shipyards, a precision strike that destroyed dozens of Imperial cruisers under construction and withdrew before the Imperium could mount a coherent response. The Third, in 909, M32, deployed the Demon Prince Talaman as a sacrificial decoy to draw Imperial Guard regiments and Space Marine chapters from across the Segmentum Obscurus into a frontal engagement they could win, while Abaddon personally desecrated the shrine world of Gerstal and destroyed the remains of an Imperial saint. The Fourth, in 001, M34, split the adamantium gates of the citadel of Cromark on Elfanor, gates described as harder than diamond, with a single blow from Drachnian, and extinguished the Cromark bloodline entirely in what became the devastation of Elfanor. The Fifth Crusade consumed the Elysia sector in 723, M36. On Taranth, Abaddon lured the Warhawks and Venerators Space Marine chapters into the ruins of Kasir Lutin, trapped them between demonic hordes and Black Legion forces, and destroyed both chapters entirely. The Sixth, Seventh, and Eighth Crusades between 901, M36, and 999, M37, dealt with internal chaos politics, claimed the gene seed of slaughtered blood angels on the world of Makan during the Ghost War, and offered the Changer of Ways a sequence of deaths arranged into what the Lexicanum calls a mathematical equation of terrible and profane perfection. The 9th through 11th, spanning 573 M38 to 301 M39, moved chaos fleets through the eye undetected during coordinated feints, clashed iron warriors against iron hands on Medusa, and subjected captive orcs to warp experiments whose purpose the lore declines to fully explain. The 12th Crusade, the Gothic War, lasted from 139 M41 to 160 M41. 2 decades of sector-wide conflict that ended with Abaddon in possession of 2 Blackstone fortresses, ancient Xenos constructs capable of firing energy beams that stripped planetary atmospheres bare and, when their power was combined, destabilized stars directly. At the cardinal world of Failbaddon during the Gothic War, 14 million people died within a single solar hour. The Imperium evacuated worlds in front of the planet killer. When the Gothic War ended, Abaddon withdrew into the Eye with weapons unlike anything the Imperium had faced since the heresy. He used them in the 13th. In 999 M41, he raised the largest army in service to the Chaos Gods since the time of Horus, crashed the black stone fortress Will of Eternity directly into Cadia's surface, shattered the Necron pylon network that had held the Eye of Terror in check for millions of years, and opened the Cicatrix Maledictum, a galaxy-spanning warp rift tearing from the Eye of Terror in the northwest to the Hadex anomaly on the eastern fringe. The Imperium was divided in half, tens of billions dead, Cadia gone. Half the galaxy plunged into permanent warp night, and the Imperium is still there. That is the number. That is the pattern. Before the structural argument can be made, one more foundation needs to be in place. The prior video in this series argued that the Chaos Gods function as a psychic support class, reactive entities born from mortal emotion, sustained by it, dependent on a living galaxy of suffering and striving beings for their continued power. The canonical language from the Warhammer 40,000 wiki is precise. The Chaos Gods are dependent upon the emotions of mortal creatures, especially the hordes of humanity, for their power and continued existence. The warp itself, the dimension these entities inhabit, is described canonically as an ocean of chaotic psychic energy, raw emotion given physical form, a mirror of mortal experience, shaped by it, populated by entities that are nothing without it. If that is true, it has a military implication that rarely gets stated directly. Every general who serves gods that need their enemies alive is fighting a war his patrons structurally can't afford him to finish. Not because he is incompetent, not because the Imperium is heroic enough to stop him, because the entities who funded his armies, gave him his weapons, and sustain his power have a specific metabolic requirement that his final victory would end. The number 13 isn't a record of failure. That is this video's argument. It's evidence of something else, and the evidence has been accumulating for 10,000 years. Start with the mechanism, because the mechanism is what changes the frame. The warp isn't a separate reality that occasionally touches mortal existence. Canon describes it as a dimension that echoes and underlies the familiar four dimensions of the material universe. Every act of war, every experience of plague, every moment of despair or rage or sensation anywhere in the galaxy bleeds psychic energy into the immaterium. Over millions of years, those emotional currents pooled into the entities that became the Chaos Gods, vast psychic presences composed, per the canonical Chaos Gods entry, of the fantasies and horrors of mortals. Their power waxes and wanes with the intensity of those frequencies. In times of galactic pandemic, Nurgle can eclipse even Khorne. When wars peak across multiple sectors simultaneously, Khorne surges. The tides and currents of the warp aren't random. They are the accumulated emotional output of every sentient being in the galaxy, channeled and metabolized. A Black Crusade, viewed through that lens, isn't primarily a military operation. It's a psychic event scaled to sectors. The 13th Crusade provides the most thoroughly documented example. Months before a formal assault on Cadia's orbit was launched, Typhus's Death Guard plague fleet had already spread disease through the Agrippina, Cadian, and Bellis Corona sectors. The hive world of Bellis Corona was consumed by plague zombie infestation before a single heretic Astartes had set foot on Cadia's surface. Apocalyptic cults erupted across dozens of worlds, preaching the emperor's punishment, generating mass despair and the specific psychic frequency of existential terror.
The Cadian pylons were fighting to suppress warp pressure building from the Eye of Terror at what the Lexicanum describes as an unprecedented level, slowly destroying themselves in the process. Solar flares began erupting near stars adjacent to the Eye. The Eye's surrounding warp storms expanded, per canonical sources, to engulf entire star systems, all of this before Cadia's orbit was contested. Word-bearers' forces operating across the wider theater enacted rituals on captured worlds, unleashing warp storms and demonic hordes across surrounding sectors. Through the sacrifice of 1 million innocents, a warp storm intense enough to cut the entire theater from further Imperial reinforcement was generated. 1 million deaths translated directly into warp power. The distinction between military objective and psychic output collapses at that scale. The deaths were the product and the point simultaneously. The canonical statement of how this mechanism actually works comes from the Lexicanum's Gods of Chaos page, attributed to a pilgrim of the Emperor's children named Narvo Quinn. Win or lose, the gods feast on our deeds. A man pets a stray, and his small pleasure in the act of kindness feeds Slanesh. A woman strikes her crying child, and that awful moment of elation she feels feeds corn. A Munitorum drone considers suicide. Nurgle grows fat on his despair. A merciful strategist devises a plan for bloodless victory, and Tzeentch is content. The word-bearers think the gods crave worship, but the gods care for nothing save filling their bellies with our sorrows. Intentionally or not, we are all meat for the beast, win or lose. That is the detail. The military outcome of a Black Crusade, whether it seizes territory, achieves stated objectives, ends with chaos forces advancing or retreating, is one variable. The warp output runs continuously regardless of how the campaign resolves. A crusade that achieves total military victory generates psychic sustenance. A crusade that is militarily repulsed, but which still kills billions, generates decades of despair across the populations it touched, destabilizes sectors for generations, also generates psychic sustenance. The difference is military. The feeding isn't conditional on winning. This is why the structural argument's central distinction matters precisely here. Winning a war and feeding from one aren't the same operation. A concluded war, a dead Imperium, all resistance eliminated, all humanity silent, ends the food supply. An ongoing catastrophic war that wounds deeply but never finishes its prey feeds indefinitely. The campaign that killed 14 million people on Failbaddon in a single solar hour and then withdrew into the Eye of Terror still generated that psychic output. Whether the Gothic War was a chaos victory or a chaos defeat, the warp recorded what happened there. To be direct, no canonical source states that Black Crusades are deliberately structured with a built-in ceiling on success. No codex describes them as formal feeding operations. The canonical facts are that chaos feeds on mortal emotion, that a living, suffering Imperium produces far more of that emotion than a dead one, and that 13 major campaigns have each ended without terminal Imperial collapse. The interpretive step, that these facts are connected by structural design rather than coincidence, is this video's argument. The pattern is canonical. The intentionality is interpretive. The competence argument deserves a genuine hearing before the structural argument moves through it. Games Workshop's current official position presents Abaddon as a long-game strategist. The First Crusade retrieved Drachnion, a weapon the Lexicanum describes as the thorn in reality, spoken of with fear even by demons, whose essence stems from the four powers simultaneously, and which the Chaos Gods themselves have reportedly attacked, as if they resent a weapon outside their control existing within their champion's hands. Not an incidental find, a specific strategic acquisition that the 12th and 13th Crusades depended upon. The 12th Crusade secured 2 Blackstone fortresses, weapons the Imperium had classified as catastrophically dangerous, weapons without which the 13th Crusade couldn't have happened as it did. Abaddon at the Battle of Gethsemane managed to extract 2 captured Blackstone fortresses, despite facing the full strength of Battle Fleet Gothic. He kept them for 750 years. Then, he used them. The 13th achieved what no prior Chaos military operation had managed. Cadia is canonically destroyed. The Cadian pylons, Necron devices placed millions of years ago specifically to contain the Eye of Terror, are gone. The Cicatrix Maledictum has permanently altered the strategic geography of the galaxy. The Warhammer 40,000 fandom article on the 13th Crusade states the outcome clearly. The Eye of Terror began to expand without limit. Abaddon seized the Cadian Gate with the Planet Killer and his remaining Blackstone fortress, and the forces of Chaos prepared their final drive on Terra. These aren't failures. The strongest version of the competence argument claims something more interesting than hidden victory. Each crusade makes the next more possible. The math of progressive degradation, each campaign weakening Imperial defenses, each acquisition enabling the next operation, is real and produced a real outcome. Games Workshop confirms the intent directly. 13 Black Crusades, each described as having their own dark agenda and key objectives. The intermediate objectives were genuine. The strategic degradation was genuine. The 13th Crusade was, on its own terms, a Chaos victory. Now notice what happened immediately after. The forces that just achieved the single greatest military victory in 10,000 years didn't press into a terminal Imperial collapse. Guilliman's Indomitus Crusade launched, traversed the galaxy, stabilized Imperial worlds on the Terran side of the rift, and eventually forced a passage through the Nakmun Gauntlet into the Nihilus. The fact that this was possible, that there was something left to stabilize, something to reach, confirms that the 13th Crusade, for all its destruction, left something to survive it. The post-Cadia status quo became a perpetual attritional war across new fault lines, with no defined terminal condition on either side. More war, larger scale, wider zone. The canonical counter-argument must be acknowledged directly. The Chaos Gods' internal rivalry prevented coordinated exploitation of Cadia's fall. The Chaos Gods entry is explicit that, had the Chaos Gods worked in unison in the wake of that terrible event, real space would doubtless have been utterly consumed. Interdivine rivalry is real. It explains local failures. It explains why individual campaigns stall after initial momentum. What interdivine rivalry does not explain is why the pattern of devastating but non-terminal repeats across every major Chaos military operation in documented history, including the one time Chaos came closest to total victory. Horus reaches Terra. His forces defeat the Imperial blockade. He has the conditions for a siege the Imperium can't survive. He allows the Emperor to teleport aboard the vengeful spirit rather than maintaining the winning position.
Whether that decision was Horus's own final break with chaos, his realization, per community synthesis of the lore, that his father had been right and that the ruinous powers had been using him as a puppet, or something else entirely, the outcome is identical to every subsequent campaign. A catastrophically damaged Imperium that survives, and a long war that continues indefinitely. Interdivine rivalry explains why chaos can't coordinate after a victory. It doesn't explain why the commander whose specific capability is forcing chaos coordination produces the same outcome of survival, with devastating damage 13 times consecutively. The question the structural argument asks isn't about individual crusade outcomes. It's about the pattern. 13 campaigns with the same shape, maximum damage, no terminal push, isn't bad luck. It's a consistent structural outcome. And consistent structural outcomes are usually produced by consistent structural incentives. 4 gods, 4 metabolic profiles, 4 different domains that share one structural requirement. The canonical baseline first. 3 of the 4 major chaos gods predate humanity. Khorne came into being during Earth's Middle Ages, drawn from the wars and bloodshed of early civilization. Nurgle crystallized during the Great Plagues of that same era. Tzeentch emerged from the scheming and ambition of the first complex societies. Slaanesh is different, the youngest of the 4, born not from humanity but from the psychic catastrophe of Eldar excess, a god created by an entire civilization's concentrated emotional output, consuming most of the species that created it in its birth cry. The canonical dependency statement uses careful language. The Chaos Gods need the emotions of mortal creatures, especially the hordes of humanity, not only humanity. Slaanesh's survival after the near annihilation of the Eldari confirms that a Chaos God can persist through the near extinction of its primary food source. The argument doesn't require that human extinction kills the gods. It requires that a dead Imperium represents a catastrophic reduction in the primary feeding source, and that the gods' specific domains make total victory impossible for them to actually benefit from. Khorne. The canonical description, wrath incarnate, the embodiment of a never-ending lust to dominate and destroy. Never-ending is the operative phrase. The Warhammer 40,000 wiki describes Khorne's sole desire as to drown the galaxy in a tide of slaughter, to conquer and kill every living thing. But the phrasing of desire is different from the structural reality of what sustains him. Khorne's domain is war, murder, rage, and martial bloodshed as ongoing acts. His sacred number is 8. His realm in the Immaterium is described as requiring unending battle, not concluded battle. The throne of skulls built from the heads of champions across 100,000 species, but sitting atop a mountain that must keep growing. Static accumulation isn't what Khorne feeds on. The ongoing act and its emotional resonance, rage, the confrontation of warrior against warrior, the continuous flow of blood as a metaphor for the continuous state of violence as an emotional frequency, are what sustain him. Kill everything, and the blood flow stops. The lore preserves this internal contradiction within Khorne's own domain without resolving it. Khorne cares not from where the blood flows, only that it flows. Flows, present tense, continuous tense, never having flowed. Nurgle. The first edition Warhammer fantasy roleplay source states it with precision. Nurgle's power grows strong when his plagues are epidemic upon the good folk. Epidemic implies movement. Movement requires living hosts.
The current 40K Nurgle entry describes the domain as dependent on the despair of mortal dread, specifically a fear of death, perhaps the oldest fear of sentient species.
The canonical description of what feeds Nurgle is visceral. The whispered prayer of a parent over a fever-struck child. The anguished pleas of the dying man for one more day of life. These are meat and drink to Nurgle. The domain requires living minds for the fear to inhabit, living bodies for the disease to move through, living populations for the despair to accumulate in. Nurgle isn't a god of death in the sense of extinction. He is a god of dying, which is a process that requires a subject who hasn't yet died. A galaxy of sterilized rock produces no hosts, no prayers, and no despair. His power waxes when pandemics sweep the galaxy. It wanes when there is nothing left to infect. Think about what a Death Guard plague fleet actually does on approach to a target world. Weeks before the landing craft breach atmosphere, the plague ships seed the outer system with spores. Astropathic stations go dark one by one as their operators sicken. The planetary governor receives the last transmissions from neighboring systems, fragmentary, increasingly desperate, then nothing. The population of the target world knows what is coming. That anticipatory dread, that specific flavor of helpless foreknowledge, is feeding Nurgle before the first plague marine sets foot on the surface. The plague is just the delivery mechanism. The despair is the point. Slaanesh. The canonical Warhammer Fantasy Wiki entry summarizes the metabolic requirement. The Dark Prince is fueled by extremes of mortal sensation, experience, and emotion. The god of excess requires beings capable of sensation, desire, obsession, and the descent into temptation. Any extremity of experience opens communion. Slaanesh's birth was the psychic explosion of Eldar excess, concentrated to critical mass over millennia. Not a single dramatic act, but the accumulated weight of a civilization that had spent thousands of years pursuing sensation without limit, until the psychic resonance of that pursuit reached the detonation point. Slaanesh survives the near annihilation of the Eldari because other sentient species continue producing sensation and desire. A galaxy without beings capable of experiencing sensation, obsession, or the pull toward excess is a galaxy without Slaanesh's food supply. The domain requires not just living beings, but living beings capable of wanting, feeling, and going too far. The Emperor's children killing fields, the atrocities they enact on captured worlds, aren't primarily military operations. They are cultivation. The specific quality of the suffering they engineer, the sensory extremities they force on their victims. These aren't cruelty for its own sake. They are farming. Tzeentch. The Warhammer 40,000 wiki states the dependency directly. Tzeentch feeds upon and is empowered by the mortal emotions of need and desire for change that is an essential part of all life in the universe. The changer of ways requires change to engineer. The architect of fate requires fates to manipulate, problems to remain unsolved, ambitions to remain frustrated, schemes to remain in motion. The same canonical source notes that Tzeentch can never achieve any ultimate aim, for to do so would be the end of ambition and thus the end of the Lord of Destiny. Resolution is structurally prohibited within his own domain. His schemes touch the lives of every living thing, which requires living things. A concluded galaxy, all schemes finished, all fates resolved, all living ambition extinguished, gives Tzeentch nothing to work with. The Thousand Sons' relentless pursuit of forbidden knowledge that destroys them piece by piece,
the Alpha Legion cells seeded through imperial bureaucracies that manipulate events toward ends no one can fully read. These aren't strategies aimed at imperial collapse. They are maintenance of the exact psychic conditions that Tzeentch requires. A galaxy full of unsolved problems, unfulfilled ambitions, and the specific anguish of understanding that the future is being rewritten by something you can't quite see. The Lexicanum's Pilgrim quote captures all four simultaneously. A man petting a stray feeds Slanesh. A woman striking her child feeds Khorne. A bureaucrat contemplating suicide feeds Nurgle. A strategist devising a bloodless victory feeds Tzeentch. Every mortal act in every direction generates food for one of the four. The gods aren't selective about the content of the emotion. They are selective only about the requirement that emotion continues to be generated by living, experiencing, emotionally capable sentient beings. A genocided humanity isn't an offering to any of the four. It's silence. The implication follows directly. Across the entire documented history of Warhammer 40,000, the Chaos Gods have never demonstrated collective behavior consistent with genuinely wanting total human extinction. Every major military operation they have sponsored, the Black Crusades, the demonic incursions, the Horus heresy, has produced wounds, disruptions, expanded zones of psychic trauma, and more war. Never elimination. The most dangerous thing Abaddon could actually do to the Chaos Gods is win decisively, deliver total imperial collapse, silence the galaxy's largest source of psychic energy, end the war. The tools he has been given are powerful enough to make him a permanent existential threat, not quite powerful enough to guarantee a conclusion. This is the argument, not hidden lore, an inference built from the canonical feeding dependency premise applied to the documented pattern of 13 inconclusive campaigns. The pattern is canonical. The structural interpretation is this video's. The inference is that a structure which consistently produces exactly one outcome across 10,000 years is working as designed. The Cicatrix Maledictum is the clearest test case. Before the 13th Crusade, the Eye of Terror was held in check by the Cadian Pylon network, Necron constructions of immense antiquity placed to suppress warp activity in the region, possibly predicting the Eye's formation millions of years before the heresy made it relevant. Abaddon's strategy in 999 M41 was built specifically around destroying those pylons. Not Cadia as a fortress world, though taking it was necessary. The pylons themselves, the suppression system that had kept the Eye of Terror from naturally expanding into the Cadian Gate for millions of years. When the Blackstone Fortress Will of Eternity struck Cadia's surface, the pylon network failed. Cadia began to tear itself apart from tectonic instability within solar hours. The warp, already in turmoil from decades of escalating psychic catastrophe across the entire campaign, could no longer be contained. The Cicatrix Maledictum tore open, not a local expansion, but a galaxy-wide wound stretching from the Eye of Terror in the northwest to the Hadex anomaly on the eastern fringe. The Noctis Eterna, the long night, descended. The Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that allows warp navigation, went dark across most of the galaxy. The Lexicanum describes the temporal distortion that followed. In some areas, time slowed. In others, it sped up. Some regions experienced centuries of subjective time in years. Others were frozen, barely moving. The effect lasted for standard decades in some systems, 33 days on Terra itself, and significantly longer in regions deeper in the Nihilus. The Imperium Nihilus, the half of the Imperium cut off from Terra by the Great Rift, is described with precision in the canonical sources. Cut off from the Astronomicon, warp travel made catastrophically dangerous, requiring life-threatening navigational effort for even short jumps.
Astropathic communication so difficult it requires, per the Imperium Nihilus entry, Herculean and often fatal effort just to push a single message across the storm front. Slightly less than half of the 1,000 Space Marine chapters remained unaccounted for after the Noctis Aeterna. 12 chapter homeworlds were reported destroyed, entire populations cut off from the Imperium, believing themselves the last surviving humans in the galaxy, holding out alone against demonic incursions, mutation, and the systematic erosion of everything they understood. The canonical description, plagues of mutation, madness, and supernatural disease blossom while landscapes warp and change beneath baleful skies. Malefic entities manifest seemingly at will to prey upon the unwary, while simple despair stalks every human soul. And always the Great Rift blazons itself across the firmament, corrupting all that its noxious light touches. Half the Imperium, living permanently in exactly the emotional state the four Chaos Gods require: terror, despair, isolation, ongoing incursion, the corruption of faith, the knowledge that help isn't coming, the slow conversion of loyal populations into sources of psychic sustenance for the very entities besieging them. The forces of chaos move through the Nihilus on favorable warp currents, carried swiftly toward their targets while Imperial defenders struggle to execute even basic maneuvers. Billions dying in isolated pockets with no reinforcement possible. The Noctis Aeterna consumed worlds the way a forest fire consumes fuel, thoroughly, systematically, leaving no structure intact. Imperial worlds throughout the Nihilus didn't simply lose their connection to Terra, they lost the conceptual framework that made the Imperium feel real. A governor on a world where warp night has lasted for decades does not govern a planet of the Imperium of man. She governs a besieged outpost at the edge of a void that has swallowed everything she was told was permanent. Guilliman's Indomitus Crusade launched, stabilized the Imperium Sanctus, and eventually forced a passage through the Nachmund Gauntlet into the Nihilus. The fact that this was possible, that there was something left to stabilize, something to reach, confirms that the 13th Crusade's legacy isn't the death of the Imperium. It's the expansion of the zone of perpetual conflict and psychic trauma. More war, at larger scale, across a wider region, with no terminal condition on either side. Inside the rift itself, per the canonical Lexicanum entry, the ongoing state is described as the war in the rift, an ongoing conflict between the Chaos Gods as well as the Imperium. The four patrons take the new feeding ground and immediately begin competing for it rather than using it to conclude the war against humanity. That behavior isn't a collective decision to spare a food supply. It's four entities whose nature makes conclusion structurally impossible, perpetuating exactly the conflict their domains require. The Great Rift isn't chaos winning. The Great Rift is chaos enlarging its farm. That framing is the argument, not the canon, but the canonical facts support it. The rift was created, the Imperium survived, the conflict intensified and expanded across both halves of the galaxy, and the ongoing war in the current era has no defined terminal state. What the 13th Crusade produced wasn't the end of the long war. It was the long war at a scale that had previously been impossible. More fear, more despair, more rage, more sensation at the extremes, more schemes running simultaneously with no resolution in sight. The galaxy bleeds wider, and the gods drink deeper.
The argument closes on Abaddon himself, because the structural argument isn't ultimately about the Chaos Gods. It's about the man who runs their operations. Ezekiel Abaddon was first captain of the Luna Wolves, later renamed the Sons of Horus, the premier fighting force of the galaxy's premier legion. The Horus Rising novel notes that Sejanus's martial record was second only to Abaddon's, easily forgotten when in his presence. He was a member of the Mournival, Horus's inner council of 4 captains, trusted on questions of strategy and philosophy. He was there at Istvan III, at Istvan V, at Terra. He watched Horus fall. He took Horus's body from the floor of the vengeful spirit and detached the talon of Horus from his dead Primarch's armor as a deliberate act, not grief, or not only grief, but a promise. Then he led what remained of the sons of Horus into the Eye of Terror. What he did there distinguishes him from every other major chaos champion in the post-heresy era. He refused demonhood, where other champions, including Horus himself, accepted the transcendence that the gods offer, the transformation into something other than human. Abaddon refused it. He remained, in a galaxy that had moved 10,000 years beyond the heresy, a mortal enhanced by chaos gifts rather than consumed by them. The distinction matters because it's the basis of his autonomy, and his autonomy is why the gods can never fully control him. He built the Black Legion over centuries of internal chaos conflict, while the other traitor legions tore each other apart in the Legion Wars. The organizational achievement of uniting 9 traitor legions into coherent military action under a single banner, in the political environment of the Eye of Terror, where ancient hatreds between legions predate the heresy itself, where every demon prince and chaos lord has 10,000 years of grievances to prosecute, has no equivalent in post-heresy history. Interdivine rivalry is real. Abaddon is the one instrument capable of suppressing it long enough to run a sector-wide campaign. Whatever else he is unique. The galaxy hasn't produced another like him in 10,000 years. Aaron Dembski-Bowden stated his motivations directly in 2013. Abaddon doesn't want to destroy the Imperium. He wants to succeed where Horus failed. He wants to be emperor, to have humanity bow beneath his will, not end it. The arcs of Omen materials frame it more directly still. Abaddon wants to kill the emperor and take his place as ruler of humanity. Both formulations agree. Conquest of a living humanity, not its extinction. His stated goal aligns, accidentally or not, with the structural feeding requirement of his patrons. Dominion over billions of living, producing, suffering humans is a better outcome for a chaos god than silence. His relationship with those patrons is a studied act of resistance. He serves chaos undivided, all 4 simultaneously, specifically to avoid being too deeply bound to any single god, preserving the autonomy that makes him useful and that the gods find unbearable. ADB's Black Legion novel states the tension with precision. The power is ultimately Abaddon's, and that is what the gods can never forgive. His greatest strength is also his deepest flaw, because he won't bow to the pantheon. The Ouroboros image that ADB's lore uses for his fate is exact, his destiny described as a serpent devouring its own tail, the pantheon perpetually chasing a submission he will never give. Both parties locked in a relationship neither can end. The gods can't take the submission they want. Abaddon can't achieve the conclusion his stated goal requires. Both perpetuate a process that serves the gods' feeding requirement, and Abaddon's continued existence as their most powerful instrument. The tools they gave him are genuinely extraordinary. Drachnian, born from the first deliberate murder in human history, spoken of in fear by demons, the entity that fought the emperor himself in the webway during the heresy, bound into a blade that can rend reality wherever it strikes, is powerful enough that the Chaos Gods themselves have reportedly tried to destroy it. A weapon they gave their champion that they have also tried to take back.
The Talon of Horus, recovered from his dead Primarch's arm, carries the weight of the Horus heresy itself as a symbolic claim. Abaddon isn't Horus's successor by accident or community appointment. He claimed it by taking the instrument of the Primarch's greatest act from the body before anyone else could. The black stone fortresses, held for 750 years after the Gothic War, spent in the 13th Crusade on a target that couldn't be taken any other way. The pylon network that had held the eye in check for millions of years. These aren't the tools of a failed commander. These are the tools of a man who has run an operation that has expanded the zone of chaos influence more than any event since the Horus heresy. And still, the Imperium survives. The campaigns grow in scale with each iteration. The First Crusade forced Cadia's militarization. The 12th acquired the weapons that made the 13th possible. The 13th split the galaxy. The scale of each operation is demonstrably larger than its predecessor, the damage demonstrably more severe, but the shape remains constant. Maximum destruction. No terminal push, withdrawal or strategic pivot before the final collapse. An enlarged farm where there was once a smaller one. Whether Abaddon understands this or not is the question the canonical record can't answer. ADB's portrayal implies genuine belief in his mission. A man who has been fighting the same war for 10,000 years because he believes it's winnable, because he experienced Horus's failure at close range and has spent every century since calculating how to avoid repeating it. The Ouroboros of his fate might be invisible to him, or it might not. If he knows he can't finish, and runs the operation anyway, for his own reasons, for the power, for the control, for the unique position of being the one instrument capable of threatening the entire galaxy, then he is complicit. A man who understands his function and performs it regardless, because the alternative is irrelevance. If he does not know, then he has been a feeding implement for 10,000 years while believing he was fighting for victory. The gods gave him everything he needed to be maximally useful, just not quite enough to be actually decisive, powerful enough to be a permanent, credible threat, not quite powerful enough to guarantee a conclusion. The asymmetry is precise enough to suggest design, but the suggestion can't be confirmed. That is the calibrated position. The canonical facts create the pattern. The interpretation of the pattern as intentional is the argument. He broke Cadia. He opened the Great Rift. He is the single most destructive force in the post-heresy galaxy, and he has been that for 10,000 years. And the war is larger now than when he started, and there is no end in sight, and the gods are feeding better than at any point since Slanesh was born. He isn't their champion. He is their instrument. The galaxy burns just enough, always has, always will, because that is exactly what they need. And 13 Black Crusades aren't a record of failure. They are evidence of a design working exactly as intended. If you want more analysis like this, following the logic of established 40K lore wherever it leads, regardless of what the conclusion turns out to be, subscribe. More videos are coming.